listening to the Liturgy Seminar at the Toronto School of Theology and the University of Toronto. The Liturgy Seminar promotes discussion on a wide variety of topics in the study of liturgy, including liturgical theology and history in all periods and traditions, ritual studies, and pastoral liturgical practice. For more information, visit us online by Googling TST Liturgy Seminar.
Godly work online. So bear with me. What I did basically, I looked at the different categories of perspectives that will allow us to think about what it is that we're experiencing there. And I'm going to speak about setting. I'm going to speak about the perspective of the liturgist. I'm going to speak about the perspective of the person meeting to pray. And I'm going to speak about theologies and emotions. So just to speak about the setting, and Grimes reminds us how heavily the setting is influencing any kind of worship experiencing. Also, online worship, not surprisingly, has specific settings, and they influence online worship experiences. Here is an array of potential settings with their different their different possibilities and also stumbling stones. We start with the very cemented, the YouTube pre-recorded video, worship video that has been curated, sometimes even by a person who is doing this full-time for a specific denomination for each Sunday or for each Shabbat of the year. Those videos are usually relatively short. They may be 5 to 10 minutes long. They're inviting a community of prayers to watch a video together and then engage in a different modality of worshiping together. Then there are live services that are taking place in person in a specific location, but they're live streamed so that people can witness them as they are happening, but have no possibility to influence them, to participate them, or to become part of them. Another possible setting is the Zoom webinars with Q&A options, in which worshipers can join a presenter or a liturgist, and then in the end or at different moments during the service have very carefully curated possibilities to kind of chime into the service, or they can drop their questions in a chat, which will then be brought to the worshiper. It might be comments, it might be expressions of gratitude, it might be names to be remembered, but it is by no means, and I think this is one of the moments that invite great misunderstandings, it is not a non-hierarchical setting. There has been quite a lot of writing about the flattening of hierarchies of online worship, which has excited a lot of people, especially like liturgists who have been feeling lonely or in the presenting mode, facing a congregation frontally. But also online worship comes sometimes with quite steep hierarchies, and it is important to keep that in mind. A little flatter becomes the hierarchy in a Zoom meeting where we all have different like the same sized screen squares. But mind you, also in this setting, I can now pinpoint spotlight my own screen. I can mute you, I can unmute you whenever I wish to, or at least I used to be for a long time. So even that doesn't come with a completely flat hierarchies. They do allow us, in addition to the more non-hierarchical setting, they do allow us to break into small groups. Some of them can be directed. I can assign you to a small group. Other ones can be pre-selected or self-selected according to the wishes or interests of the people present. And then there is Form E, something that seems to dawn as we're talking quite presently at the horizons for a couple of us who deal with the more practical aspects of worship, and that are all kinds of hybrid forms. They range from a regular service led in a sanctuary with just a little camera transporting the image of the sanctuary into the World Wide Web so that everybody can watch, to conversations about communities who think about all the people who will not be able to join the in-person worship again. Will it take place? And the ways in which we might think about those different kinds of communities that we are about to be shaping, both the one in person and the one online. Is this one community? Are we talking about two separate communities? What's the cohesion between the two? Am I creating two different worship experiences? But we definitely speak about two different settings, and we have to think about the themes between them and the ways those two different communities are going to interact. And then there is what most of us still remember, I think, the good old in-person setting of worship. This was just an outline of the different settings. I'm moving on to the role that most of us, I think, in this setting are familiar or intimately familiar, the role of the liturgist, the one leading worship. And I have structured, you might see that at a first glimpse, I have structured the different modalities to think about this new rising role of the liturgist from an emotional point of view. Because I realized that a lot of the conversations about online worship are often driven by a certain emotion more than by technical questions. And I think that's wonderful. And I do want to add a little bit of theology to that conversation. One thing that has become quite clear is that the role of the online liturgist is different from the role of the in-person liturgist. It comes, for example, with the new task of just holding a Zoom room for a couple of minutes before the service or after the service so that the gathered worshiper can exchange the different kinds of small talks and informations they would usually exchange without the presence of the worshiper, but are now dependent on us holding the Zoom room for them to conduct those conversations that for so many of the people praying with us are an integral part of their worshiping experience and their sense of being connected to a community, or probably, as some of you might say, the body of the church. And the same is true for the enactment of the sacraments. Those are radically different elements of worship. They cannot be done online the way we did them in person. Some churches especially have decided to not enact them at all. Some people have found ways to make them work online. Some people have been even more creative and they did them in person and then shared them with the community, which is only possible, of course, if you're relatively close in space and under careful health. You know what I want to say. I'm missing a word sometimes. Another new aspect of the relatively new role of the online liturgist is the professional pressure that many of our colleagues are feeling. As people can shul shop or church shop online, there are ample possibilities of comparing one church service to another, comparing one synagogue to another. Synagogues and churches and mosques, all kinds of worship settings have different resources and different possibilities to put up the perfect online show. Some congregants might be looking for this. Some congregants are critical of what we do. Some congregants come up to us and say, I have been somewhere else and there it has been better. And increasingly, clergy has been telling me that they feel that pressure and that they're suffering from it. So with the freedom of our congregants comes a certain point of vulnerability for us being constantly compared and constantly being held up to the standards of maybe a different clergy person or a different culture altogether. Another thing that came up for online worship leaders was the fact that many of them are leading the worship from their own homes. Some of them do attend their sanctuary where they have full video and sound equipment, and they might produce or put up or just simply pray from their sanctuaries, their own services. But most of us are sitting in our living rooms. And with the sitting in our living rooms comes a new intimacy that many of us enjoy, as we can share home rituals. We're creating new possibilities to show objects, liturgical objects, to create them from the scratch. We're more flexible when it comes to the flow of our services, but we're also losing a great deal of our privacy. You probably noticed by now that the background behind me, for example, is an artificial background, which is necessary because I sit in my bedroom. So now I'm not here, I'm here relatively relaxed, and it doesn't matter so much. But if the background would float away in the wrong moment of the service, so if my baby would come in screaming because my husband would be helpless, those things are moments which some worship leaders may enjoy, and in other moments they're just wildly inappropriate, and people become increasingly also anxious about the loss of privacy, not only for the time of the pandemic, but especially for the time after the end of the pandemic, when congregants might still feel entitled to have access to this very new kind of private, intimate prayer experiences we have been affording them over the last month. One quite interesting way to think about this is the new thing that is happening to our faces. As worship leaders, we are usually used to being perceived as a small figure in the front of a relatively large congregational body. Our facial expressions have never been driving a worship experience, and they have never been holding a liturgical experience for our congregants. That now is radically different. Everyone can see the way you look at them. If you smile, if you stumble across over a word, what you do with your face becomes for many of our congregants the most immediate experience of what is happening in prayer. That has great potential because we can model certain modes of prayer, we can model certain emotions, we can use this new presence of our face to present something, to represent something even. We can share intimate emotional aspects of prayer that we might not have been able to share in a more removed, distanced way in our sanctuaries. But it also demands from us something that some couple of colleagues and I started to call flattening, which sounds more negative, I realize, than what we originally had intended. It doesn't have to be that my face becomes flat, but it is asking from us the willingness to become flat for the people for whom we lead worship, and to show our faces as a new tapestry on which worship can evolve, and not try to hide behind a talar or a certain garment or altar. We are there, we're radically present, and our faces are large on the screen. One thing that a lot of people have spent a lot of time talking about are the roles of visuals. It's become increasingly clear that visuals in any modality have become much more central to a worship experience, our faces being just one of them. It is also our backgrounds, it's the objects we're using. We can show, we can be very directive, we can even be manipulative in showing and sharing videos and picture images. It has also become clear that this is maybe the aspect that is most different from what we have been doing before. Because what we have never been able, and what I think we never wanted to do in a pre-pandemic, pre-online worship era, was to direct the eyes of the worshipers. I think most of us would agree that 80% of the time, the people praying with us are not directly listening and have not directly been watching us. They have been watching around. They have been maybe completely drifting in their own thoughts. they might not have listened to our sermons at all. In fact, they might not have an idea what we have been talking about 5 minutes after they left church or synagogue. But what they have been doing instead is that they were able to sit down, not looking at anyone directly, usually, and become quiet. And we know that using our eyes, just evolutionary, is a mode of trying to grasp something, trying to think about something, trying to engage in a logical flow of thought. None of this is true for sound. But when we switched from an in-person worship to a worship in front of the screen, many of us have been taken away the possibility for our congregations to kind of drop into a space of emptiness. And they're reclaiming it by switching off their videos and sitting in pajamas preparing dinner. And a lot of us are becoming frustrated with this experience of trying to share worship experience with people who are preparing dinner or who are not even looking at us. But it started to dawn on us, I think, that when people are doing that, they're trying to recreate the modality of simply being and being fed a certain kind of sound tapestry and being able to drop into this and becoming free to whatever arises within them, that we do not allow them if we force them to sit in front of their TV, front of their computers, like they sit in front of their TV, watching us trying to deliver meaning through the screen. So moving on to the music, I learned from musicians that using rhythmical sounds during an online service is highly effective and highly manipulative. So they have all been advising me to use more melodic elements, which allow, again, for that sort of more drifting mode. There's different ways we can think about sound being played live or being or using pre-recorded materials. We can think about something that is more spontaneously evolving as opposed to something that is carefully curated. We can think about the solo singer who is singing for the congregation. We can also experiment with a more responsive singing between the liturgist and some individual congregants, which I know has been done increasingly, which requires a little bit of patience, but it is absolutely doable. One thing that can be marked positive, at least for some of us, is the new freedom to improvise. When I'm leading worship by myself and not with co-leaders, not with a choir, not with other liturgists, it is really up to me. I can invite the worshiping community into my own rhythm, into my own flow of prayer. I can stop, I can move on, I can pray quicker, I can slow down, and I can take an entire congregation with me as it seems apt in the moment. I do not need to wait, and I do not need to stick to any script. Some of us find that liberating, some congregants find that increasingly disturbing. And something that is another new freedom and another new necessity, maybe, is the evolving of new liturgical language. Leading services from home, especially when it's what we call a life cycle event, a bar mitzvah, a baptism, whatever it is, and we are not together in one space, pushes us to think about new ways in which we can be together, worshiping in prayer, ritualizing, finding new ritual expressions of deep meaning while not being together in one space. Again, some of us find that liberating, some of us might find it oppressive, but it is definitely a necessity that a lot of us have been tackling during the last months. From the perspective of the community, and this is true for entire communities, but also of the for just one worshiper confronted with the question, how do I pray while not being in in-person worship settings? One thing that has been brought up many, many times is just this radical disembodiment of worship. what I've been talking about a little bit, speaking about the drifting mode of worshiping, comes with the togetherness of bodies in a shared space. We sit together, each of us separately, but we sit in a shared space, breathing together, smelling each other, hearing paper rustling, smelling perfumes, smelling wood, maybe smelling stone, having a sense of our shared heartbeats and rhythms in that space. All those tacit, tiny aspects of worship have been gone. They have been replaced by the specific individual environment of the worshipers sitting by themselves at home. So this is something that very few of us usually think about while preparing for worship, but worship doesn't smell the same anymore for all the people present. People don't share the same kind of pews or chairs. Every person has their own sensual environment in which they pray, and it might come with totally different associations than there have been before. Then, of course, the great loss, depending on the denomination and religion, that comes with more or less pain, is the loss of congregational singing, unless it is carefully curated, cut video productions that are, of course, still possible. An interesting phenomenon is the stretching of liturgical spaces, meaning that basically at any moment, not at any moment, but from any place on the globe, we are able to to join almost any given church or synagogue at that time, as long, of course, as they are putting together any kind of online worship. It might not always be our preferred time of the day, but locality is not a limit anymore. It also compresses liturgical time in through both synchronous and asynchronous worship. So let me just give you an example. There have been quite a lot of people, I think, historically, who do not like to get up very early in the morning. Those people now have, for the first time, the possibility to just join another church or synagogue or mosque that prays at another time of the day, and they can flexibly join whatever synagogue fits to their own biological rhythm. That becomes even more easier in the cases of worship communities who create pre-recorded worship services and put them on their websites so that congregants and also non-congregants can download and watch them at any given moment whenever it fits, may it be midnight or 6 o'clock in the morning, which means that people can begin and end and enter sacred time much more according to their own needs than it is to any given liturgical calendar of any given denomination. Interestingly, while that is true, there is also an increased meaning of the liturgical calendar and liturgical time altogether, because people have told us that especially when sitting at home and being in the same physical environment every single day, what days seem to blur into each other. And it is especially the weekly and monthly and the different festivals of the year worship that signifies time and allows people to suddenly refer back to the same event last year. Just an example of the first festival that was changed or that kind of was marked by COVID was the Jewish festival of Purim, which is about to be celebrated in 2 weeks from now. That was for many of us the last time we gathered together in synagogues. And as the yearly celebration is coming up in the calendar this year, it is for us maybe the strongest marker of it has been a year. It has been a year of lockdown. And I don't think that we will celebrate Purim in the same way again for a couple of years to come, because that celebration has taken a completely new meaning. It is the celebration that at its core speaks about the reversal of the world, inside, outside, up and down, the reversal of hierarchies. Nothing could have been more true than whatever followed the last Purim of 2020. What I've been already hinting at was the increasingly individualized liturgical time, unbundling, that is called, that people pick and choose whatever they want and whatever they need in order to feed into their spiritual lives while being at home. It might be to listen or watch only specific parts of the services of their own congregation. It might be to join other online worship communities. It might be to stay absent altogether and then only join you once a month. It is definitely an increased freedom to leave, come, drop in early, drop in late, leave early, switch off a video, whatever our worshiper needs, they now will feel empowered to do it. They're increasingly comfortable in front of the screen, and we also allow through online worship access to entire populations who have maybe not been able physically to enter our worship spaces, be it maybe because they're people with disability, maybe people who are sick, people who gave birth, people who are uncomfortable showing their bodies in public. For all those people, online worship opportunities are new opportunities to connect with the sacred in a safe and comfortable way from their home. And it is especially these populations that, at least in my world, many people are thinking about when we think about the next chapter and ways in which we can allow that kind of increased accessibility and access to people who really might need it. And with that, I'm going to close. Definitely, we're talking about an expanded liturgical access and repertoire, not only for the ones who need it, but for everyone, because as people are shul and synagogue and mosque shopping, they learn different things. They have more access to a more diverse liturgical languages and physical expressions than they ever had. And they're learning that there are different ways to access God. Which brings me to the next slide. I have two more slides. It's just for you for orientation. And this is the ways we can start to think about this theologically. I come from a world in which online worship is usually welcomed, at least on a theological level, quite enthusiastically for the factors of accessibility and comfort, and often also intimacy and possible improvisation. I did realize in conversation with Christian colleagues that a lot of them, especially when thinking about possibilities and limits for the sharing of the sacraments, experience online worship as an absence of holiness. I have thought a little bit about possible theological language in order to frame this. The language that came up to me most naturally was the language of God's face. Selel Melohim, I think, allows the Jewish community to kind of speak about the ways God is experienced in worship or in a community in the most direct and immediate way. So for people who experience online worship as the absence of holiness, it is the metaphor of the hidden face. Again, also interestingly, something that is connected with the festival of Purim, and the fact that in the book of Esther, God doesn't show up directly, might capture a little bit of the questions and the pain that online worship brings up for some of us, because frankly, we don't know if it works, which has been a really shocking question, I think, in the simplicity of the question when it was raised in our seminar by someone who has spent his life learning that doing specific things in a very specific way creates holiness. And what do we do if those specific things and those specific ways have been made impossible? And how can we know that God is here? One possible answer is that God is on the screen. And I'm coming back to the metaphor of the flattened face, which means that to a high degree, it is in the hands or in the face of the worship leader, of the liturgist, to bring God into the service through word, through face, through gesture, through intention, through silence, through music, but it's definitely something that we do in order to bring God into the worship experience of the people worshiping with us. Then there's a metaphor of God between the screens and God in the internet. God is somewhere there when we are worshiping. We don't need to look into each other's faces. We don't need to create anything, but God is somewhere in there among us. For someone, I think if you saw this presentation already, I think it was the childish metaphor. I put away the word childish, but it is something I think that is an interesting metaphor to play with on a poetic level. It is something that I think theologically leaves us a little wanting. Then, of course, we have the metaphor of God between the faces on the screen, which is beautiful in its own way, but it's still a metaphor of lacking or a face of lacking, because very obviously God also would have been present between the bodies and faces of people in in-person worship, and having God only between the faces on the screen is still a metaphor of lacking. God among the virtual community is a face of less lacking, because it acknowledged the fact that there is real community coming together and it's not just faces on the screen. Still, we are in a metaphor of lacking. God among the community present takes the community presence seriously. That is the theology that might come closest to our former in-person worship experience. It is all together forming the body of the church or the kehillah that allows us to do what evokes holiness for all of us. And then there is, and I've heard this from the more enthusiastic among my colleagues, a new image of God. It's the new face, a face in which it is not my face or your face. It is the face of the screen, but it is the image of all our faces together. And that might be a new face or a new faith to think about the kind of theology that evolves in not only a different media, but the way in which this different medium is shaping the experience of God for many of the people out there, and maybe also for ourselves. And I think being a year into lockdown and into leading online worship, I do think that also we as worship leaders or people who reflect on worship might come up with an answer. If I would ask you, does it feel differently? Does it feel differently to conduct and lead prayer online? And in that different is not only loss and lack. In the different, I think there is also sometimes a new sense of something that hasn't been before. I do want to change on the notion of emotions, because I realize that they're driving the conversation, anyhow. So we might as well just name them. A lot of us are driven by sadness / loneliness / the yearning of being back together. A lot of us are feeling overwhelmed, challenged to an extent that is unwelcome. Some of us might come with relief because they don't need to be in person anymore. For some of us, that is a relief from putting on clothes, from putting on a show, from standing upright. We can be a little bit more huddled up together. Some of us feel inspired by the new challenges. Some of us love to learn new technology. Some of us embrace the necessity to create new rituals and new ways to conduct old ones. Some of us feel hope because they feel that this might be an experience to learn from, and that might help us to recreate or renew older, maybe outlived forms of worship. And some of us look at this from a point of, what can we gain from this? What can we learn? Where will this lead us to? And they want to celebrate where we are at. I leave it up to you to decide where you see yourself in the spectrum. But all of those different emotions will lead us to different questions. this is the end of my presentation. I think it is quite clear that I could ask at least 2 or 3 questions about every single bullet point on every single of those slides. And I think I kind of want to leave it to you what kind of conversation you would like to have, be it very practical, be it theological, be it personal. I also don't know, I have to admit, I don't know too much about the culture of this group when I'm not here. So I think I maybe want to leave it to David and Bill to kind of guide us through the next remaining minutes together.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sonja, for laying out this kind of taxonomy, if you will, of liturgical experience online. It strikes me that it's you've given a kind of phenomenology of online experience. I mean, there's a kind of thick description of a lot of different dimensions of our experience. So I'd be very much interested in people's comments or questions. Perhaps there are connections in what has been said to your own experience, or perhaps your experience has led you to make other kinds of connections that haven't been touched upon explicitly. Probably the best way to do this is, because I can't see on the size of my screen, even though it's pretty big, I can't see everyone. But between David and I, we can try to catch any hand raises. And you could also put in the chat, if you have a question, just sort of put, I have a question or I have a comment, and we'll try to keep track of those.
Then for organization, Bill, the raise hand is on the button in reactions. You can choose a raise hand, but after that, lower hand when you finish. And also put your question on the chat, no? For example, Bill, we have a question for Katia in the chat.
Okay, where do I have it here? Oh, from Katya, right. Regarding D, theologies, among the Jewish community, is there people speaking about the Ruach on the screen? I'm referring to Teresa Berger's soteriological approach, which might lead to cross-references. Ah, good comments, thank you.
Yeah, I am smiling because I actually wanted to speak very much about air at some point and about Ruach as a theological metaphor for what is going on right now, us sharing air. And I realized it didn't work. It didn't work for our people because I think right now air is such a loaded, dangerous element that people have shrieked away from using that metaphor, even though it is quite out there for us to grapple with it, but I don't think we're there yet.
Interesting, yeah.
And you know, like the events of last summer and the sentence, I can't breathe in the middle of the epidemic, that has all to do with breathing, I think just further complicated the notion. But yeah, yeah, thank you for that question.
Just in passing, one of the things that occurs to me that connects with something that I was thinking about is just how much I miss making music and singing with people simultaneously. And a big part of that is breathing together, right? And I've come to a new appreciation of the verb to conspire in all of its complexity. I long to breathe together with people in worship in ways that I haven't been for a long time. So that has to do with life-giving air. Any other comments or connections that people might be making? Ralph Carl, good to see you.
Hi, sure. I mean, I'm so glad to be able to come to this. Thank you for organizing it and, you know, researching this in the midst of this, right? Sonja. I mean, I just read on the CBC app that all of those doctors who were part of the curling bonspiel macro spreading event last March are researching themselves now and how their curling bonspiel became a super spreader event because they realized it was a research opportunity. So I'm glad they're doing that. But this presentation, Sonja, was amazing. I mean, I'm a parish pastor at a Lutheran church in downtown Toronto, and so many of the points you made, I just found them so apt and so resonant. Like the question of sort of how people can shop around and the kind of sense of anxiety that it produces among my colleagues and myself about sort of who's performing better, which one is better, should we be doing these live streaming, should we be doing these videos, should we be doing Zoom? I mean, it's so out there. I think it's been a sort of an emotional burden, if you will, in a sense, and some of us feel guilty, some of us feel smug, whatever we feel. But so that was really apt. And this whole question of where God is in the screen as you unpack that, I thought that was just beautiful. I mean, I'm sure we all have good examples. I will say the most sort of nerve-wracking but also rewarding experience I've had so far was the funeral of Scott Weidler, who some of you will know as a noted liturgist and church musician who died 2 weeks ago or so. So about a week ago, we had the online funeral with 350 people from all over North America at this big liturgical funeral. And lots of when you look in the Globe and Mail and read the obituaries, it says a funeral will be held when the COVID restrictions are lifted and conditions permit. Are we really going to go 2 years from now and have all of those funerals that we've sort of loaded up and that are waiting to be held? I think that's and Scott was so clear. I'm probably going to die in this pandemic. Don't wait. Have a Zoom funeral. And I think he was right, and we were all crying together online. So I hope you don't mind. I took screenshots of all your slides because I just thought they were so beautiful. So thank you.
Thank you, Rob.
We have a question, Bill, from Lawrence.
Yes.
Question. Yes.
Yes, Lawrence says, I wonder if you would comment on the pacing of the liturgy. I find the service leaders tend to talk too much in an attempt to explain a particular prayer, but it can result in interrupting the rhythm of Kavanah. And what about introducing narratives into the service or posing questions for the worshipers to ponder? So it's about the pacing and the inner spiritual practice of the experience of worship. You're muted. I'm sorry, Sonja.
I think that question goes back a little bit to what I tried to capture a little when I spoke about the mode of drifting that many of the people in prayer find themselves in. I think as worship leaders, we have been lying to ourselves for a long time about the ways people are present with us when we lead worship. I think we, really assume that they're listening to what we say and that they understand us intellectually, also want to understand us while being with us in prayer. And now that we find ourselves in front of the screens, we're full of anxieties because we feel that they might understand us less well. And because we're smaller now, or they might be distracted by more things, or so we explain more. And we become a little bit more hectic and we think about how can I preserve the message now in a different medium. And what I learned in the conversation with colleagues is that especially exactly what Lawrence Englander is pointing to is that it might not be about explaining what I'm doing or trying to do something that is as similar as possible but to what we did before the beginning of online worship, but it might be exactly about thinking, how did it feel to them before we had to change the medium? And what can I do to make it feel similar to them? It might need it might lead to me needing to do completely different things, or doing the same things but without explanations, because adding another layer of explanation will most likely make them feel quite differently about whatever I've been doing. But it does require a certain kind of trust. We can't over-edit our online worship experiences. We have to trust them to get it or to get something for themselves, even if we can only make an offering.
Ian asks, how do we create a sense of intimacy within the community? Perhaps that can also be related to what David has asked. Does the ontology and nature of the community change? Intimacy and community expressions, for example. Any thoughts on intimacy and community?
I am happy to, offer
Sure.
a response, but please, none of this has been meant to, I'm not the online worship expert, not more than anyone here in the room. I just happen to have put this PowerPoint presentation together. I do think, many people said to me, it seems to be relatively easy to preserve a community that's been existing before. It is really hard to create new communities between people who have not known each other before the pandemic. And I think some of it, again, has to do with our tendency to begin a worship experience with the first sentence of the liturgy and to end it with the last sentence of the liturgy, and not to give space for the mingling, for the informal just being before and after. And it might also have a lot to do with our anxiety to be together online in silence, just looking at each other. There's a, there's a billion ways to think about that experience of being in silence together online. One is to switch off the view of your own self, which I think most people find most distracting, is to see themselves all the time. But you can actually switch that off by hovering around your screen. There's an option to switch yourself off. It can also be resolved to pick a random person, by picking a random person that is not you, and just focus on them and their face, and maybe the different ways in which you can offer your presence to them while being in prayer. Or again, the most radical way that our congregants found is to switch off the worship service as it is unfolding, and to come only back looking at people for the more informal mingling moments before and after. Which I think create a feeling, again, a feeling, maybe not the aesthetics, but the feeling similar to what people had attending actual synagogues and churches. Because while being in prayer, I think, again, we might have been lying to ourselves. I think most people sit in prayer more by themselves than with all the other people. They're inside, they're sharing a space, but they're tapping into themselves. And I think this is the greatest luxury, or the greatest gift we could afford them.
Yes, Nancy, you can unmute yourself, please, Nancy.
Sorry, I just lost my speaker, but go ahead, Nancy.
I have an experience as a congregant with a church that does live streaming and YouTube. And I have an experience as a presider with a Zoom service. And when I first started doing Zoom, I thought it was really terrible because it was jerky, it was amateurish, and it really wasn't very good performance. But I have become quite pleased with Zoom because it allows more intimacy. I can see the faces of the people while I'm preaching, certainly more than I would if I were preaching in a pulpit. And so the whole question of a performance versus participation, I think, is a live one. And I have been interested in my own reactions to the possibilities.
Lots of good comments and offerings in the chat as well around different experiences of silence and different experiences of building community through Zoom interaction.
We here, Card and myself, we participated since March, I think, no, Card? In a Zoom online service in a community that we belong, that before we met once per month, but now we met every Sunday. And Card, why you don't share with me that you are very more articulated some of the experience? Because we have singing, preaching, and preaching together, silence, mute, everything. We have tried.
It's interesting, David, to compare the two liturgies. When it's a very small community, when we meet online, it's very weird, at least to me. I almost prefer the Zoom gathering. Certainly, it's in the Roman Catholic tradition. So rather than going to watch the Zoom Mass from my parish, I just feel like a spectator. I don't do it. I've never done it. I just feel, what's the point? But going to the smaller group, and perhaps that's the key, it's a small number of people. We know each other. The Zoom link is open perhaps for a half an hour ahead of time. The liturgy begins, and for example, even the Lord's Prayer, everybody unmutes themselves. It's completely not synced. It's just noisy cacophony, and yet it seems to work. And I'm not sure why. I think part of it is the community already exists. We have a chance to mingle before. Rabbi Sonja, you were saying that, and also there's a chance to mingle after. I'm fascinated by Zoom, and I think this example that David brought up works. For example, at least for me anyway, at my parish, it does not.
Along the lines of what Nancy was saying, I'm also interested in things that people have been surprised by. I'm sure a lot of you have had such experience that one small thing, I could list a long list of things that I've been surprised by with respect to Zoom experiences of liturgy. But one small thing that happened recently at an Emmanuel College related gathering, I think it was you, Sam Kavanaugh, who's the spiritual life director there, at the end of one of the services invited us, I forget how it was put or what the invitation was, which in itself is interesting because it wasn't the invitation that mattered, it was the experience of it. Invited everyone just before we all left to, and some of us, myself included, had my video off because I do find it difficult to be focusing on all the little boxes in the context of worship. That sort of wandering experience that can be prayerful. I like to turn off my video so that I can just not always be visually concentrating all the time in the same space. But at the end of this, we were invited to turn on our video and just look at the gathering. Just sort of look appreciatively and thankfully and appreciate the fact that we were all here just as the service was ending. And I found that strangely affecting, like strangely moving to actually just be intentional and look around and find myself sort of thinking, oh, there's Teresa and there's Ralph and, and there's Pablo and whatever. Just suddenly it was like a sort of in visual prayers of the people, happening as a result of that. And afterwards I thought, that's not something that I would necessarily do in a worship service. I wouldn't look around, I wouldn't look around the space and gratefully engage the presence of everybody there, right? But I did in Zoom in a way. I was surprised by the potential of that to create a kind of intimacy, a kind of prayerful connection with other people. And it's left me wondering how much more could be done on that front. Well, our time has come to a close. Sonja, I really want to thank you on behalf of everyone gathered here for being with us today. It's just been great to have some things to think about and help give us some structure to continue our reflections on this immersive experience we're all having of online life in worship land. So thank you very much for agreeing to be part of this today. Thank you everyone for so enthusiastically responding to our humble invitation to join us online. We're going to be once again gathering on Wednesday, April the 14th for our next gathering. So
You are listening to the Liturgy Seminar at the Toronto School of Theology and the University of Toronto. The Liturgy Seminar promotes discussion on a wide variety of topics in the study of liturgy, including liturgical theology and history in all periods and traditions, ritual studies, and pastoral liturgical practice. For more information, visit us online by Googling TST Liturgy Seminar.